So we're talking about these three axes that Augustine articulates for how to determine whether our eating and drinking habits are out of whack, right? Whether we're tending towards the vice of gluttony. And so we're on the social axis, and I want us to sort of continue to think about it here because this one is so important. This axis is so important, and I think this is one of the major ways where gluttony can show up and where we're prone to not notice it. So remember the question that's guiding us on the social dimension in thinking about eating and drinking. It's, are my eating and drinking habits damaging my relationships with others? That's the question I want us to consider. And the idea here is that I so love food, I so love drink, I so desire food and drink that I'm willing to allow them to get in the way of loving others, of being in relationship with others. And so the last examples I gave were about, drinking alcohol in front of my mom or drinking non-kosher food in front of some of my family members. And in many cases, the reason I'm doing it is because I'm thinking about me, not them. I'm putting myself, my own tastes, my own desires above my relationships with others. And I'm doing it for the sake of food and drink. I mean, think how stupid that sounds. It's crazy. Let me give you a few more examples. I want to drive this home really deeply. So, years ago, I watched this documentary, and so I want to be careful here. I'm not certain that this documentary is 100% accurate. I didn't go and do a ton of research after I watched the documentary to see if there were any biases and whatnot in it. I'm sure there were. But so think of this as an illustration. The documentary was about chocolate. And I actually have looked into this a little bit, and for the most part, what I'm about to describe is true. I don't know how much change has occurred since the documentaries like the one I'm about to describe have been aired. But this wonderful documentary about chocolate cultivation in various parts of Africa. And what it demonstrated, what it was revealing or exposing, was the amount of slavery, child slavery, occurring on these chocolate plantations. Lots and lots of kids are actually yanked away from home, taken out of school at the age of 8, 10, 12, and they're working 16, 18 hours a day on these plantations in order to help cultivate, grow, and manufacture chocolate. And part of the point of the documentary was to expose these chocolate manufacturers, these chocolate companies, for their exploitation and even involvement and encouragement of child slavery. After I watched the documentary, I told my wife, we can't think about chocolate the same way, can we? We have to approach chocolate differently. So are my eating and drinking habits, are they contributing to the exploitation of others? Now that I've told you this about chocolate, it seems to me that you need to think about chocolate differently. Investigate. Do you care enough, or is chocolate too important to you? Is it so important that you are going to ignore this phenomena? Another example. Years ago, my wife and I, we were very close with the international students at our campus. And we would have them over regularly. And so that closeness built, we had a kind of intimate relationship with many of them. I came home from work one day, and all of the Korean female students at our school were sitting around the table with my wife, and some of them had tears streaming down their cheeks. As I entered into the conversation, I learned that they had been making lunch in the communal kitchen of their residential hall. And Korean food has a particular odor, just like any food does. And as they're making their Korean food, which I don't know about you, but I love Korean food. As they're making their Korean food, the odor, right, is spreading throughout the halls, and a number of students are, of course, smelling it, and they overheard the students mocking it, saying how terrible it is, gagging, fake gagging, and making fun then also of the culture that would dare to eat such food. These students were understandably hurt by hearing these remarks. And here's the point that I want to bring out. Our pickiness can get in the way of our relationships with others. We have students who want to go to India with us. We take students every year to India. My wife and I have been doing this for 10 years now. And we have students who want to go to India, and every single solitary time we advertise and then interview students for the trip, every time we have one or two students who don't go because they're afraid of the food. I get being afraid of the food in other places. Sometimes it does make you sick. Sometimes, right, you're worried about the sanitary conditions in certain places. I totally understand. I'm not saying that it's not legitimate to be concerned about eating and drinking in other countries. But my point is to allow that to get in the way of us having this perhaps life-changing experience. That does start to sound a little extreme. We've had students who are so picky, right, that they end up bringing an extra bag, an entire suitcase filled with food so that they can make sure that they're able to eat in India. That's brilliant. I'm not criticizing that. Here's what they're doing. They're saying, I'm not going to let my eating and drinking habits get in the way of perhaps experiencing God and His people in a really remarkable way. So they figure out a way around the problem. They're not letting their pickiness get in the way of their relationships with others. The third axis that we need to consider with respect to eating and drinking is this: the spiritual axis. And here's the question: are my eating and drinking habits damaging my relationship with God? We have to eat to survive. We are dependent on food to live, and thus dependent on external things to live. Now, this dependence should recall to our minds that we cannot live without external conditions being satisfied. Our need for food mirrors our other needs that we have, spiritual needs that are very food-like. We need God's sustenance for both our bodies and our souls. Does our eating reflect this? Does it reflect our awareness of this? Does it recall to us that God is in control and we rely ultimately on Him for everything? Do our eating and drinking habits, do they unite us to God? Are we eating and drinking to the glory of God? Think about the Lord's Supper. One of the most important practices, rituals of Christians involves eating and drinking. So eating and drinking are clearly seen as symbolic ways of uniting our bodies, our souls, to Jesus Himself. So we've got this spiritual axis that we've got to keep in mind as we eat and drink. All three of these axes have to be taken into consideration, according to Augustine, lest our eating and drinking habits damage everything.